that Vivek Ramaswamy is a symbol of actually a rising Indian presence, and I think particularly the English-speaking world, the Anglo-Saxon world, is really, I think, far more open to outsiders.
So in this week's Rajamandala, in your column, you've looked at a lot of curiosity in India and I'm sure around the world about Vivek Ramaswamy. He's been an up-and-comer in the Republican primaries, the first, as you put it in the article, the first big surprise kind of. He seems to be in the recent debate. He did quite well, according to most observers. One of the reasons, of course, in India we have such an interest in him is that he is South Asian. He's of Indian origin. He's been a successful businessman. Well, there was an impression that there seems to be there's Rishi Sunak in the UK now. Vivek Ramaswamy is a rising person. There's Kamala Harris. One aspect of it, of course, is that there's the rise of South Asians. The other is there a sense that it's the South Asian vote, or a lot of the South Asian communities was either Democratic earlier, moving to the Republicans, or vice versa, because you seem to have them on both sides.
No, I think the total size of the South Asian vote is not so significant to make a difference to the larger structure of the politics. But in places like Canada, for example, or in Northern England, where there's a concentration of Pakistanis, South Asians, or Punjabis, or Sikhs, where they make a difference to the seats and outcomes. But in this case, in the US, there are a few areas of concentration of, immigrant communities. For example, the Latinos or the Cubans in Florida, where they have an interest. But I don't think we are Indian or South Asians are at such numbers in any one particular place to make a difference. They are in significant numbers, but it is not the size of the diaspora. Equally, Indian diaspora is also influential because it's rich. In a way that they can make significant contributions to candidates. So that's another way of influence. But I think what we've seen happen in the last decade and more is more and more Indian Americans are participating in the US politics. So if you see the first generation immigrants, the idea is to save money, send as much home, secure your position, and avoid politics. I mean, I think the first generation Americans don't get into politics. They focus on their professions. But the second and third generation Americans, I think Vivek Ramaswamy is a second generation. His parents had migrated to the US in the 60s. So this generation is actually participating in the US politics. So they're all citizens of the United States. And the US is pretty open system. So a lot of them, in fact, the US Congress, there are at least 4 Indian American congressmen who came through last 2 elections. So they're Kamala Harris, of course, has been a senator before she became vice president. In the state legislatures, there are a large number of Indians, South Asians, being elected to the local legislatures. So I think it is the rise in their political activism and the willingness to join what in India would be risky. India professionals don't join politics. That in the US, I think the diaspora is joining politics. And I think you're only seeing Vivek Ramaswamy is only one window. But if you just walk up the US Congress today, I mean, you see any number of Indian Americans working as staffers, as assistants to the senators. So he's partly training politically, getting trained and maybe later contest elections. And in the administration, which is actually professionals move into the government for a short while, come out. As I mentioned in the piece, Biden alone seems to have appointed close to 140 Indian Americans to different positions in the administration. So I think it is the integration into the political system, their activism in the political class, and they're beginning to rise in the political hierarchies in the US system. I think that is the new thing. But as we said, it's been an ongoing process. And the fact that there were 2 Indian Americans in the debate. I mean, Nikki Randawa-Nikki Haley, too, is an Indian American. She was a governor of an important state, South Carolina. So I think it's a new trend. We're going to see more and more second-generation Indian Americans, third-generation Indian Americans participate in their political process.
There is just a quick follow-up to that. There's, as you mentioned in the piece, everyone should read it. It's on the indianexpress.com, and it should be wherever you're watching this video. I mean, we have so much of this anti-colonial now, or the evil Anglo-Saxon empires and neo-colonialism, and I'm sure there's some truth to that, of course. But what does it say even about, I mean, whether it's England now, England, of course, we have more numbers, but America, where, like you say, it's not like there's a vote bank that you tap into straight out of identity to win Carolina, one of the Carolinas as governor, being a brown woman. It cannot be that there's no vote bank there, there's no religious, it's not a conservative Christian vote bank there. What does it says something about the openness, perhaps, of their kind of democracy, what is happening in the Anglo-Saxon world?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's no question. I mean, I think particularly the English-speaking world, the Anglo-Saxon world, is really, I think, far more open to outsiders. Once you you have the talent, you have the capability, there are far more opportunities to rise. I mean, so we're just looking at the political side. Other day, there was a list of Indian American CEOs heading different companies. So I think US, of course, is US, Canada, Australia are nations of immigrants. So you see large numbers of Indian Americans. I think Indian Americans are growing in Australia. In Canada, as we already noted, the Punjabis and Sikhs and now other Indian communities are already part of the political process. But they're all open for the minorities to participate. There is no real discrimination. You join one of the mainstream political parties, you work with their system. So that is what is happening in this part of the world. But of course, we have a complex. I mean, as a former colonial, everyone is bristling all the time, but your connections are still there. I mean, all your elite sends the children there. Every engineer who's in engineering college wants to go to one of these Anglo-Saxon countries. So I think we have this love-hate, but I think the love is actually probably more than the hate, because it's really the upper end of the political class that debates these issues. But it's been a really robust, growing relationship between the two societies. And I think the politics is beginning to change, because now India, US, largely their interests are aligned on the global domain. But in the past, they were not. So what you have is really, this is really going to create a lot more synergies. But as we also noted, just because South Asians are there doesn't mean automatically translate into good things. Yeah. The divisions in South Asia get into divisions there. So that's part of the problem. But in any case, what we're talking today is really that Vivek Ramaswamy is a symbol of actually a rising Indian presence. I think the second feature I would say, Kamala Harris, for example, I mean, I think most Indian Americans are really Democrats. They tend to go with the Democratic Party. There are a few Republicans. That Vivek Ramaswamy is in the Republican Party. He's defining himself as a true-blooded conservative American. That's what is interesting. I think, of course, a lot of rich Indians in the US do support the Republican Party. But I think what we have is, here is someone really taking up the conservative agenda with a passion. Of course, he argues better than Trump, so his English is better, his skills are better. But he's laying out a conservative agenda with such conviction.
Take on that conservative agenda and the piece, there's something like, I mean, the trend you point out, there is, of course, there's an understandable interest and perhaps even admiration and celebration of him. At the same time, he seems to now, at this point, at least on foreign policy, what he's articulated in the debates and what he said, take the sort of Trump era isolationism, which has been a tendency in American politics since at least before the First World War. And that Trump was somewhat, he said he'd pull out of Ukraine, put those troops on the border, that's where the investment should be. I think I just was listening to an interview with that comedian, Bill Maher. He's just done one hour interview where he's saying FBI and income tax the tax authority should be abolished. He's a man, and he's like you say, he's much more polished than Trump. But that isolationism does have, because as we saw, an American executive leader can truly disrupt or at least have a major bearing on how the world sees itself in global alliances and people paying for themselves, as you point, paying for our own defense, the erstwhile allies, not the current allies of the States, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's in Europe, do you think that there's a What do you make of that isolationism?
Look, I think there are two aspects. I mean, I would say one is the you know, given the American strength, their weight in the global system, even small changes in US policy can have a dramatic effect on other nations because the US is such an important player. For example, look, for almost 40 years, the US was involved in Afghanistan. But the moment they decide to go, I mean, Taliban is back.
Yeah.
So you can say, look, you can crib, complain, but the fact is the domestic politics on Afghanistan has changed fundamentally. So the effects, the consequences of how US sees the world, even minor changes in that, will have an effect on the countries, a whole range of countries. For example, last few years, we've seen the US move away from globalization mantra to one that is, more decentered globalization, which is having huge effect on the global trade system, on the US-China relationship, etc. And the second aspect is that I think most of us in India, I mean, we think of the US as a domineering power, as an internationalist entity, because what we've seen in the US, really, we had very little contact with the US before the 40s. So what you have is really a sense that US is all-knowing, all-powerful. Americans want to muck around everywhere. They want to, control everything. But I think we have no familiarity as an intellectual tradition in the US. There is the counter trend. And that counter trend is deep. And as you mentioned, for a long time, the US was unwilling to enter the Second World War. It was unwilling to enter the First World War. There's a lot of opposition to the United Nations in the US, to the League of Nations before that. So I think there is this inward-oriented, or let's stay in the Americas, we don't need to the rest of the world. But I think we don't pay enough attention to American domestic politics. And we have no familiarity with this notion. So I think when Trump came, everybody in India saying, why does he want to leave Afghanistan? He's staying there till the last American is good for us. But the fact is, how the conservative see this world is an important one. And I think Trump has given us a hint that those ideas are pretty strong. They have strong resonance. And I think what we need to pay attention is, where does this come from? That US is not a monolith. There are multiple ideas within the US of how it should deal with the world. And therefore, if the US is our number one strategic partner, number one trading partner, is going to be increasingly a defense partner and a large people-to-people relationship, I think we need to pay a lot more attention to their internal debates and not treat the US as some kind of a black box, and everybody thinks the US is either a big mall or a huge university or as a job market, rather than thinking about the politics and the multiple worldviews that exist. Because tomorrow, if the US policy on Russia changes, for example, that will have a huge effect on Ukraine, on Europe, and on us. So they hear Ramaswamy talking about doing a deal with Putin and breaking him away from China. But it's impossible at this stage, it looks. But then big changes can take place. So we need to pay attention to the US domestic debates on the economy, on the society, on the politics, and hopefully, as we go ahead, Indian Express will hopefully follow this US debates a little more closely in the coming days.
We will carefully, and everyone read the column. It's on the IndianExpress.com. We'll meet again next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Akash.